Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Wild Raven Tarot. My name is Bobby. I am your host. You are watching my new series called Epithets. On this show, I bring on people from different paths to talk about the gods and goddesses that they work with and to educate us on their different aspects and their names. Last week we had Ramon Santiago on from Moon Scarab talking about Santa Muerte. It was a fantastic broadcast. You guys go back. I'll put it in the links. I should have done that already. Today we're talking with Kenn Payne. Hey Ken, how you doing?
Hi, Bobby.
Ken is the creator of the Oracle of the Hekatean Path, the deck that has become the standard for Hekatean witches with their dedication work. I love this deck. As soon as I saw it, I knew this was going to be tremendously huge. I told you this. I told Chris. You guys were like, yeah, it's going to be big. Yeah, yeah. I don't think you realized how big it was going to be, did you? I did. I told you guys.
And I still kind of don't believe it.
Oh, come on. That deck was needed. Yeah, Selena is watching. Love that deck. It is. I bought my first deck on pre-order and then I had to get a second one because I didn't like using my working deck for my um
Big time.
communion. Yeah, it just it felt icky somehow. So went and got another deck. Ken, we're talking about the names of Hecate.
Mm.
How many names are there?
Well, I'm not sure of a specific number, but we are looking in the sort of hundreds of names that kind of crop up in relation to Hecate throughout the course of her history and her worship. Um, I mean, in the deck, I only really use about 26, and
Right.
it's literally not scratched the surface.
No, there I went looking once and I came around 300-ish that I came across and then
Yeah.
I got tired of cutting and pasting. Um but yeah, there are lots and lots. Crystal Irama has joined us. How you doing? Um Purple Moon Tarot, new channel, you guys. Please check out the channel. I'm excited to have you here. I read for the first time last night. Um, so as we're talking about the names, I'm going to be in the background putting up other names for your perusal, but I've asked Ken to specifically cover a couple of my favorites. Um, we're going to start off with Inodia. Oh, before we start that, Ken, can you touch on the pronunciation? What you were talking about backstage?
So obviously, a lot, most of these epithets are from ancient Greece, and so therefore the pronunciation that a lot of us have got sort of used to is a very standardized English way of saying things. So when we see Enodia, we pronounce it N-O-D-A as it is spelt. Whereas in conversation with a couple of Greek speakers, when I was trying to sort of do a little bit of work on pronunciations, um, Enodia is actually pronounced more like Enodia because the D that we see is a the sound. And so Enodia rather than Enodia is more accurate.
Yes, anybody who is in the chat, like Selena, uh, we pronounce the D's, or in Spanish you have D's as TH. Um, so it is a carryover. I'm trying to think of a word that would be used that way, but uh, I'm blanking. But yeah, so a lot of the names are similar to Spanish, so it's not that far off. Hey, Julianne, how you doing? Um, so for instance here, this is perfect timing. Enodia. Can you explain what this name of the goddess is? And as he does this, I will be in the background showing you different names at the same time.
So Enodia, it's roughly translated to "of the road," but originally it was actually the name of a goddess herself. Enodia was a goddess of the underworld and roads, um, that originates in Thessaly. Excuse me. And she was worshipped alongside Zeus. And this is before around the sort of 5th century BCE. So this is kind of just before we start to see Hekate as a name appear in like Hesiod's works and things like that. So it's kind of she's almost like a precursor as a goddess when you look into the way her worship spread, and it spread to places like Macedonia and Athens. um, but by the sort of 4th century BCE, Enodia and Hecate were almost used interchangeably, or seemed to be one and the same. And there are some similarities between Enodia and Hecate that we would recognize. So animals such as dogs, bulls, horses, and snakes, they were found in little sort of votive offerings in the areas to Enodia. Um, and apparently dogs were specifically sacrificed to her, which again, we recognize that when we look at Hekate, and the things that we know about her. um, and it's kind of where we also get this darker aspect of Hecate, because of the underworld connection and the association with the dead and restless spirits. Enodia was especially sort of associated with ghosts and nightmares and malefic witchcraft. Um, and actually, in the region that she originates from, she was actually named as one of the 12 Olympians in that region. I mean, we when we think of the 12 Olympians, we tend to just reel off the same 12 names, but actually within the different ancient policies before Greece was, a unified entity, they all had slightly different variations on who their principal gods and principal festivities would have been. And in this one, Enodia was named pretty high up, sort of almost where you would imagine Hera to be, on a sort of joint parallel with Zeus. Um, and it's interesting as well that other goddesses also started to take on the name of Enodia. So Artemis and Persephone are sometimes referred to as Artemis Enodia or Persephone Enodia. And we know that those two goddesses as well were also conflated with Hecate. So you start to get this really intangible sort of mess of muddiness, where you're trying to pick it all apart to make sense of it, where actually it's this living, evolving, transmutable concept. um and interestingly as well, in Thessaly, where Enodia originated, you have cemeteries were tended to be placed along the roadside. And so you have that connection between the roads, the liminal space between life and death, and the cemeteries, all these things that then later became sort of absorbed by the Hekatean cult, rather than Enodia as a separate entity. Um, and Sarah Eels Johnston, in some of her work, she equates Hecate and Odia specifically in the context of Hecate's role as again, another pronunciation. Trioditis is what we would say, but it's more like Trioditis, or trivia, the three ways, and that's how we get the sort of connection with the crossroads. So it goes more from being Sorry, my computer is just trying to restart when I don't want it to.
I
So yeah,
love that.
we go from a place where Enodia is more just about roads, and then we sort of start to see the triplicity of the intersections and the crossroads that become linked with Hekate. Oh, sorry, and I literally have just like railroaded all of that information.
No, that it is a lot of information, but people have to realize how old this goddess is. And over the eons, over the centuries, it has added and added and added, and more people recognize more and more about her. So there's a lot of information to cover, and covering it in an hour's episode is just not possible. But we are showing some of the aspects as you're talking. And I do want to hit this one. This is my favorite aspect of the goddess. I consider myself, Ken has known this, he's canceled me on this before when I've been all sad. I have a view of myself as a hound of Hecate. I know other people who work with Hecate who view themselves in the same way. Um, I'm a messenger of the gods. After I pass, I want to continue to be a messenger of the gods, either as a raven with Hermes or a dog messenger for Hecate, with the divine messenger service, so to speak. Um, I said this in a Hecate group one time that after I pass, I want to run with the goddess in dog form, and a lot of people laughed at me. Um, and I wasn't expecting it, and I was all sad, and I sent Ken a letter. They laughed at me when I told it. And he sent me back something, an excerpt from a book where a man had written a poem to the goddess and described himself as a hound of Hecate. And I have it in my phone, and it really helped me at a rough time. So I appreciate that so much, Ken. Thank you. Kinagetis is the aspect that I work with most, the leader of dogs, because that's how I view myself. And then we got Kinophilos, dog-headed, uh, Knalgamet, I think, I don't know, howling like a dog, Kion, either bitch or dog, Kio Melena, black bitch or black dog. These dog aspects are it for me. The canine aspect, like Lycana, she wolf.
Yeah, and then again, you kind of start to that kind of comes in under that remit of dogs because wolves are part of the sort of canine theme that runs with Hecate. But I mean, the dogs kind of crop up in a lot of different ways when they're sort of related to Hecate. When we touch later on psychopomp as an epithet, psychopomps were sometimes said to appear in the guises of animals, and one of them being dogs. And obviously, so you can, like how you mentioned, you want to run in the afterlife as a hound, as a companion and a messenger. It's kind of there in the antiquity record. There's evidence to suggest that can happen. And certainly with the psychopomps, there's that sort of non-judgmental side of a psychopomp, that they're there as a companion and guide rather than a judgment kind of thing. They're not there to do anything to you kind of thing. They're just there to carry out a function.
A function. So we do have a question from Play Love Remember. Is she a shapeshifter?
A lot of people would refer to her as a shapeshifter, mostly because of the fact that she has kind of changed through time but in order to persist, I suppose. When you look at, as well, in antiquity, you can also see where she has these human sort of feminine body, but then animal heads. So you get this notion of transformation and shape-shifting. There are stories such as with the sacrifice of Hecuba, that, you know, the goddess, sometimes it's said it's Artemis, sometimes it's said it's Hekate, but basically the goddess takes Hecuba from death, or the, you know, from a sacrifice, and transforms her into a god, sorry, a
Oh
dog,
God.
god. It's the same word back then. And then, you know, and then she becomes an attendant of the goddess. So this notion of shape shifting is not an alien one once you start to sort of really digging into it.
Yeah, you've got aspects of Hecate where they name her as horse-headed, dog-headed, lion-headed, bull-headed, um, goat-headed, I believe.
I think there is a couple of references to goats, and then and lions and
You
snakes.
have to remember that at the time, they were associating these heads with aspects like lion for power.
Mhm.
Um, so that's where, plus, there's one of my favorite stories about Typhon and how the gods took refuge in Egypt, and that's how the animal-headed gods.
Yes, I've read that one, and I always found that really quite interesting, that they
Yeah, it's a neat
all kind
story,
of went and hid, and in a comedic kind of way, almost like put animal masks on, as if to
right?
say, you won't know it's us if we
Yeah,
just say
don't look at
it.
me. I'm not here. Yeah, it doesn't make the Greek gods look good, but in reality, Typhon was created to destroy them, so they regrouped. They hid
Yes,
for a while.
but then
Um,
but in a contrast to that, it reminds me of in the book Liber Chthoniya by Jeff Cullen. He recounts Selene during the Titan War, or the Giant War. I can't remember quite which one it is, but that she uses the horns of her moon to basically like flip one of the Titans in battle, kind
really.
of thing. And it was kind of really a powerful sort of notion that this goddess is just like charging in with these lunar bull horns and just smacking these Titans or giants out of the way.
Both, but I can't say it. Both, Bolfonos, um, bullheaded is
Mm,
one of the aspects. Um, that's also an epithet that's applied to Hermes.
yeah, and
Yes,
we see Hecate and Hermes do share quite a number of
psychopomp.
yeah, psychopomp, Enothea to a certain degree. I mean, obviously the Enothea is the feminine version. There is I think it's Enotheus is the masculine. Um, but yeah, Hermes and Hecate do have a few shared epithets. That's similarly the way um, Hecate and Zeus share some, and as you know, I mean, to be honest, she shares hers with a lot of different gods because she's kind of had exposure to them through history and the cults of the different regions. So she's kind of either been absorbed or has absorbed different things as time has gone on.
So let's you said something there that sparked. Oh, I remember what it was. Let's talk about relations for a second. You
Mm.
mentioned Zeus.
Mm.
Now there are tales that name Hecate as a daughter of Zeus. What say you?
So what you find in myth is genealogies are never usually clear cut. So if you look at genealogies for Hecate, you will generally find Asteria and Persis, Nyx, Zeus and Dione, or possibly Zeus and someone else. Sometimes Demeter and
Demeter.
Zeus. What tends to be happening there is there's usually a time difference as time has gone on. In the context of people bringing in foreign gods, because Hecate would have been seen as something from outside the established Greco sort of pantheon that we would recognize. What tended to happen was they tended to make either a relation or a marriage or some form of joining in a myth to bring this foreign concept in and to integrate it more better. So although Hecate's worship, goes back further, when you see it as being a daughter of Zeus, it's sometimes seen within the context of Hecate's being seen as more important at that time and needing to sort of almost get like the Zeus's seal of approval kind of thing.
Right.
But actually, you can also look at it from the sort of way as we know when with Zeus and Hecate anyway, that Zeus is said to honor her above all others, and so you can almost see it as an honorific title, as that he he honors her to the same extent as he has his other daughters. And if you look at Athena and Artemis, he's allowed them to be very independent and very their own entities, and so you could kind of draw that parallel as well. But I'm firmly in the sort of Asteria Persis camp for mum and dad, with the sort of concept possibly that Asteria and Nyx can be conflated, and that actually it goes a bit further back to the sort of more primordial origins of Hecate.
When we Turkey is not somewhere you would normally think of having Hecate originate in, but that area is what we're talking about originally. Um, uh, this is an awesome epithet right here. We're not going to talk about it, you guys, but delighting men, one who delights mortals, gladdens the hearts of men. That when you think of Hecate, a lot of people think dark goddess, destroyer, necromancy, but she's got her light aspects, her golden aspects. Let's talk about one of those aspects right now. Soteira.
Soteira. So again, actually, weirdly, this is one that she shares with Zeus and a lot of other gods. It basically, this is an epithet that kind of translates as savior, which to our ears and modern sensibilities, certainly any of us that have had any exposure to organized religion, we almost seem to have a bit of a bad reaction to the concept of salvation. But actually, in antiquity, this was not in a case of, oh, follow this god and they will, save you from eternal damnation. The role of savior through these deities was in the here and now. Generally speaking, the gods like Hecate, Soteira, and Zeus, Sota, it was because they had been perceived to safeguard a city or a person from harm or invasion or war or whatever. And that was where this notion of savior came from. Within the Chaldean oracles is where we see Hecate Soteira mentioned and referenced the most. Within these Chaldean oracles, which are actually just fragments that have survived, but she's mentioned in, I think it's 5 separate fragments, and seems to have this very elevated status. She's the foremost goddess within this Chaldean system. And other deities, as I mentioned, Zeus had the Sota savior epithet, but also Apollo, Persephone, Dionysus, as well as other gods from other sort of regions. You get some of the Egyptian gods have similar connections with this sort of savior
Wow.
quality. And I think even in a modern context, when we're looking at Hekate Soteira, when we're looking at her in this role of savior, if you think about maybe, if you follow the goddess, or the goddess came to you in a very, very dark time, maybe she helped you through an extremely traumatic or difficult birth, or she gave you the strength to leave an abusive relationship or to break an addiction. In a sense, that's what she's done. She has saved you,
Fuck.
or given you the ability to save yourself within that context. And so I don't think we need to necessarily have this, oh no, we don't need saving, thanks, kind of mentality, because that's not actually what she's about in that sort of context.
Right.
It's, I tend to see my relationship with Hekate Soteira as much more of just a general praise. It's not one of those ones where I'm kind of expecting something. It's just my general adoration of her, because she's quite elevated in my mind anyway, in this role.
When I think of that aspect of her, I think of it as pure spirit. Um, there is that is the spirit aspect for me. There's the earthly aspects that walk with us. There's the underworld aspects, but that aspect for me is pure spirit, and it's gotten me through a
And
lot of tough
that's actually
times.
because in the Chaldean oracles, that Soteira is the source of souls. She's the source of souls and the source of virtue. And there is this notion of this cyclical creation and destruction and such of the soul. We are ensouled, and then when we die, our soul returns to the pool of Soteira, and then is sent back out again. And so, like you say, very much connected with spirit.
My dear essence of the moon, Selena,
Mm.
the thought of anybody laying a hand on you makes the dark witch in me rise. Selena does a Thursday night show with me, everybody, and she is phenomenal to be with. Her and Ramon. I love working with those two. Um, so we've got a comment. Wow, mind blowing. You've been spending your nights in the cosmos and first to billions of pieces after I got up my orange pillow case. It looked wow. Love that. Yeah, Celine, don't get me going, girlfriend. The goddess tends to make herself known to people when they're at their worst,
Mm-hmm.
when we are at our most hopeless. That light comes through,
Yeah.
and like Selena said, she saved her from an abusive relationship. She literally saved my life and took me off the streets. And oh, you took a picture of it. I would love you to email that to me. I would love to see it. My email's in the link. So, yes, that aspect. And in your deck, that's what I wanted to say. In the deck you created, the Soteira card is one of my favorites. It is just like I imagine the goddess, pure light, pure energy, pure spirit. And that is one of the coolest cards in your deck for me. So, I'm a Leo, and Leana is an aspect. We were talking about animal-headed gods. This is one where she's shown with a head, but not always. It's the lion. energy. Can you explain this to us?
Yeah, so Lionel it translates as sort of lioness. So this notion of the female lion, which when we look at lions in the wild, we know that the girls go out and do a lot of the hunting, and the girls
All
are
the
the ones
hunting.
doing the hard work while the men are just sat there doing nothing. But so there is this notion of fierceness and power and independence, and it basically appears in a fragment by Porphyry, but it's also can be seen to be linked into the Chaldean oracles, because there is a line within the Chaldean oracles where it mentions that if you call upon Hekate often, you will begin to perceive everything in lion form. And so it's a bit of a sort of cryptic gnosis type thing, that if you're going to be worshipping her regularly and making offering regularly, and in the context of the Chaldean oracles, doing the theurgic work of drawing the divine down, that you will start to see lions and lion forms and lion energy. And what we also find is parallels with other deities like Kybele, who is drawn in her chariot by lions, and is sometimes flanked by them. And what we tend to find is that is a nod to goddesses that have originated outside towards the sort of Near and Middle East.
Mm-hmm.
And so again, we can see that we possibly have a nod towards sort of slightly further origins of Hecate, as Hecate's worship has kind of moved across into the Greco-Roman Egyptian sort of empire. And there is also another line where Hecate is known as lion possessing, or holding a lion. So it's very much intertwined, this notion of her. And there is a where is that? I'm just glancing at my notes. Yeah, so there's a carved hematite taglio in a collection in Italy, I think it might be. And it has a triple formed Hecate standing on the back of a lion. And there is a line in the PGM, the Greek magical papyri, in a spell that calls on Hecate for protection, that refers to her as being protected by two rampant lions. So again, we get this fierceness, this protective, independent energy that sort of comes through. And in the Orphic Argonautica, Hecate is described as having three heads, and that the middle one is that of a wild lion, and that this is kind of the Hecate that Medea calls, this fierce, animalistic, slightly non-human deity. And we see that kind of echoed in the original Jason and the Argonauts. That statue that you kind of get a little glimpse of has a lioness's head dead center, which for its time is extremely accurate, considering, back in the sort of 50s, 60s, whenever that was, not a lot of people probably knew much about Hecate outside of an archaeological context, but they got that bit kind of pretty spot on.
Wow, that's cool. I never thought of that. Oh my
Mm.
gosh, that's awesome.
And
Yeah, and then
I think the other ones, I think one's the wolf, and then I think the other one might be like a boar or a goat. I'm not sure.
these are all aspect. Yeah, this is awesome. So Rhea is another goddess that was associated with lions.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Sekhmet in Egypt, lion goddess. You did not mess with Sekhmet. Okay. um, yeah, so that lion aspect is powerful. I'm checking chat to see what everybody's saying. Um, so here's one this is the first name that I wanted on the list, and I moved it down so as not to appear greedy, but um Orania.
Yeah. So Orania means heavenly one, and as well as being an epithet that's applied to many different goddesses or gods as well, it was actually the name of actual sort of deities. I think there was a. I'm just trying to think. I think there was that's right. There was a muse called Urania, and she was the muse of astronomy and astrology. And you could kind of draw a parallel there with Hecate's mother, Asteria, because she was obviously of the night sky, and you can link your astronomy, astrological aspects there. It's actually also an epithet of Aphrodite. Specifically, Aphrodite Urania is known as this very spiritual upper world being, and that's what we are usually referring to in the context of Urania when we apply it to Hekate, because it's one of the three realms that she presides over. We see it both in Hesiod and through to the Orphic hymn. She has dominion in the earth or the underworld, the sea, and then the sky or the heavens. And it also means that the way you approach worship to Urania is different to how you would approach, say, the worship of Chthoniya. So Hecate Urania and Hecate Chthoniya would be approached in two separate ways. So Uranic offerings tended to be made on high altars in high places. The smoke of incense and things would go up to the heavenly realms where these Uranic deities presided, whereas chthonic ones would be more down towards going under the earth into pits and
Right.
and things like that. And so you get this sort of spiritual and celestial element, which kind of goes quite nicely with the Soteira energy we were
Yeah.
talking about, because we see it again. It's one of those things, like we said with the word salvation. When we talk of heavenly, we also kind of go, "Oh no, we don't believe in heaven." But actually, when we're talking of heavenly, we mean just upper world, not underworld.
Yeah. I love that. What you say about the incense is true. It is a different type of worship. It is a different type of vibe. It's just different, and there are so many ways to approach Hecate. So before we go on, Ken, I want to touch on this. You and I agree on this. We've said it before. The story of Zeus letting or allowing
Yes.
Hecate to
Yeah.
retain her power on earth, land, or sea and sky. The first time I heard that, I was like, "Let's allowed? What?"
Yes.
But yeah, there's that. I don't think that there was much allowing. It was more of, yeah, okay, sure,
Yeah.
whatever
I
you want.
mean, if she's just helped you win a war, the last thing you're wanting to do is get on her bad side.
Right? And she did destroy the Titan Clitus, you guys, but I think it's how, and I've always believed this, I think it's how she destroyed him with her torches. Something in that event made the rest of the gods go, "I'm not screwing with it. Nope." That's
Yeah.
that's
I
my
feel
personal
the same.
thing.
Yeah. I'm just kind of like, yeah, he knows better.
Yeah.
He knows
You know a
better
good
than to
thing.
get on her bad side.
I mean, her parents were destruction and possibility. Uh, so she's not somebody to mess with. We've mentioned Chthoniya, several times. We've talked about the heavenly aspect. Let's talk about the earth aspect.
So
Could-
yeah, I mean, it means earthly one. And sometimes it's referred to as meaning infernal, but obviously in an underworld context.
yeah,
And it's often linked with gods and goddesses that not always that are underworld related, but generally can be connected to the earth
earth.
itself. So you get obviously the sort of recognizable ones. You get Hades and Persephone, and obviously Hecate and Hermes both share it. But then you've also got deities like Demeter and Gaia that have a chthonic aspect because they are related to Earth as a plane of existence, and in Gaia's case, in being the Earth, in its entirety, as well. And it can also link to sort of agriculture and the things that come from the Earth. Um, and it's actually where you can view Hecate's association with the dead and with the sort of necromantic witchcraft. This chthonic aspect then becomes linked with the psychopomp aspect. And as we mentioned with the Iranic offerings being, usually things that were nice, they, were done on elevation. They would sometimes certainly at the public rituals at the big temples, some of the offering meal would be sort of shared out amongst the congregation, etc. Whereas in contrast, the offerings made to chthonic deities would be usually done by digging a pit or putting it in the earth some way, shape, or form. They were often burn in their entirety. So if it was an animal sacrifice, the whole animal would be burnt. Nothing was consumed by the participants. It was very much a case of all of the libations were put into the earth. Even the prayer,
Really?
sort of notion. We know when most people pray, like in organized religions, it's hands together, but Oranic was hands up, Chthonic was hands down, or if you really wanted it to get to the lamenting prayer, you would be banging your fists on the ground and shouting into the earth, because that's where those gods resided. So that's where you want your prayer to go. And then obviously if it's something on the sea or the immediate plane of existence, it would be gestured forward. You'd also get that chthonic offerings were generally more likely to take part at night in the dark. And often the animals would be dark colored, so they'd have dark fur or dark hides or whatever. Whereas with the Oranic ones, it would generally be white or other light colored
Right.
things. And you also see it reflected in where the sort of temples and the holy spaces for chthonic deities were. So you get they occur in natural caves and grottos more often than not. And you can see this with Hecate's crossroad offerings, the deepening, Hecate's supper, which you can view in chthonic terms, because you're putting it on the earth, you're not partaking in it, you're walking away and
Yeah.
not looking back because you don't know what's behind you.
I'm lucky that way. We have a three-way crossroad nearby me. So that's a good point you have. If anybody does do Hecate's supper, um, don't look back. Okay, leave the meal and walk your ass away. If you hear if you hear something, don't get curious and look behind you. No, it's
Yeah,
just
and I
not
mean, and
done.
that is entrenched in long-term superstition and stuff, but it's part of the thing, because the other notion of those offerings was a cathartic release, a cleansing. So whatever you're leaving behind, offering to the goddess to get rid of, you don't want to look back because you're trying to move away from it. And I think this is where a lot of and I'll hold my hand up with this, is a lot of problems we have is that we we're always looking back, and we're always not actually letting go 100%. We always have an attachment somewhere, and if we're not careful, we can end up constantly being dragged backwards. And I think when we look at other aspects of Hecate, my favorite for this is Borbora Forba, the eater of filth. This is the consuming flame of the goddess that just gets rid of all that nasty, horrible stuff that we don't want.
The detritus. Love
Yes,
that word.
the miasma and all that kind of stuff.
The card you chose for Borbora Forba in your deck is not a comforting card to look at by any means.
No.
I believe when I heard you and Chris talking, it was actually an image of a zombie that was used.
So yeah, in a roundabout kind of way, because when I was trying to explain to Chris what I was trying to get across with the concept of that image, he was just like, oh my god, why would you want that on a card? Why would you want somebody eating like stuff? And I was like, yeah, but it won't be as clear cut as that once we do things with it. But the notion of it comes from when we look at Hecate within the context of the sort of cemeteries and the tombs and the bodies and the dead and all that kind of stuff. And it's more to do with getting rid of all of those things that are bad for us. So, if bodies are left out willy-nilly, they're going to they're going to decompose. They're going to potentially create disease. They might run off into the water supply. So even though there were funerary customs and things, not always to the extent of our concepts of death and dying and bodies and stuff is very clinical these days, whereas back then it was a little bit more in your face. And so you might find, if you were out in the, I don't know, towards the remote crossroads, somebody may have fallen foul of bandits or had an accident and been lying there for 3 weeks, and you might find them being chewed on by wild black dogs. But when you think about that in the context of Hecate as the eater of filth, she's sending these dogs to eat this, to get rid of it, so it doesn't cause a problem to the living.
We're back to a function.
Yes. And that, to be honest, the gods of antiquity were that. They all served a function. They weren't just these people that sat up on clouds doing bugger all,
saying worship me. No, they were working gods.
You worshipped them for a reciprocal relationship of, I've given you nice things and sang your praises. Please don't send an earthquake or whatever.
Yeah, surprisingly, they would have prayed to Poseidon, a sea god, for the earthquake. Yeah, the gods are all
even
wacky that way.
Even with things like that, you would pray to. There was some epithets of Ares where you would pray to him to end the war as well as start it.
Right.
Because if it had started, you still needed him to stop it. So there were these kind of peace-related epithets that you'd still have to propitiate Ares to get to the other side of a conflict. So yeah, I mean, it's all functionality in day-to-day life.
These were necessary things. So we've talked Ketonia. We're going to take a slight shift to the side and talk about psychopompe. So this is an aspect that a name that many gods shared. Hermes is a psychopomp. Hecate, psychopomp. Other cultures, Anubis is a psychopomp. Anubis is conflated with Hermes a lot at the time. What say you about this aspect?
So, yeah, I mean, literally in all cultures across the globe and throughout history, there is always a psychopomp of some description. And these are guides of souls. They're usually taking the soul from the body at the point of death to some form of afterlife or some waiting room before you go on to the next bit. So obviously, you mentioned Anubis. Anubis would help you go through to the weighing of the heart against the feather of Mat, and that kind of thing. So sometimes they were they were the sort of intermediaries between point A and point B. And again, you start to look at it in relation to the concepts of liminality and transition. And when you look at Hekate as the psychopomp, the best example is probably within the Homeric hymn to Demeter, in the myth of Persephone's descent and ascent, because at the end, when it's all more or less sorted, Hekate becomes this companion and guide, and she is the one that takes Kore down when it's time, and she's the one that brings Persephone back up, when that time's over. And so she becomes almost like this psychopomp of the spirit of life, of spring renewal, and also the queen of the underworld in this cyclical nature. But a lot of us do view, or we do hope that when we do part ways with this realm, that Hekate might be the one that comes to collect us, kind of thing, because that's how we would like it, as a psychopomp. I mean, I wouldn't mind it if Anubis or Hermes or one of the others turned up, to be honest, but beggars can't be choosers.
I'm curious just to see who's going to show up myself. So there's 3 I'm hoping for. So we'll find out.
But yeah, and as I think I mentioned earlier as well, that with the psychopomps, it's a function. They're not there to judge. They're not going to go, "Oh, you've had a bad life, you're going to be in for it now when you get up there," kind of thing. There's none of that. It is literally that they are taking you and guiding you to make sure you don't get lost. And in some way, in a companion sort of role, to take you, wherever the next bit is, whether that's to Charon, to cross the river, or, go and get your heart weighed, kind of thing. It's just, whichever one
could be
you end up
anywhere.
with.
I truly believe everyone's afterlife is for them only. So even if, like, say you and I died in a car crash together, we're going in 2 different, even if we're going to the same place at the same time, we're not being seen together type situation. We're in our own realities. That's how I see it.
Yeah.
It gets, when we get into things like that, it's personal for everybody. Should this aspect be feared?
Well, not really. I mean, I think a lot of the fear we have around concepts of death and dying and that is, a lot of it is I would say is unwarranted, because it's something that happens. It's a natural part of being immortal. Obviously, yeah, we don't want to go out in a horrible, painful, prolonged, drawn out suffering kind of way. But but once we're dead, we don't really have much say in the matter,
right?
But even when we look at working with Hekate as the psychopomp, people can sometimes say, "Oh, you shouldn't really work with those type of aspects. You might be inviting misfortune or inviting an early death on yourself." And it's like, well, actually, no, because a lot of people that tend to work with the psychopomps are actually doing it as to act as an intermediary on this plane for the people that are passing over, so that they almost like hand them over. And again, death becomes very clinical as well, and so does the lead up to it. Dying can be a very scary, lonely thing. But if somebody's there to sort of hold your hand, literally and metaphorically, and guide you through that veil to the psychopomp that's waiting on the other side, there's a lot less fear attached to it. And
Right.
I just think it is a lot of the it's all to do with how we view things. We've really got to change certain things that the way we
The
perceive.
mindset.
Yeah.
So we had somebody ask, did you say Chiron? The ferryman,
Yes.
Charon, is who we're talking about, who is a god in his own right. He just happens to have the function of crossing people over. So we have covered a lot of ground here, believe it or not. We're ending on well, there's this one, and then I'm going to bring up another one. But let's talk about Brimo for a second here. This is the one of the most terrifying aspects of the goddess. That when people ask, "Is she a dangerous goddess?" and I kind of go like this to myself, and think there's a couple. This is one of the ones that I think of.
Well, I
That
mean,
can be dangerous,
that question,
angry.
is this a dangerous goddess, or is
Any
you,
god is
yeah, you
dangerous.
could say that about a toaster. Is this toaster dangerous? Well, not if you use it properly. If you're
Not
going to
if you don't stick a knife in it.
stick a fork in it, then yeah, be expected to blow your head off. But with with Brimo, the name, the epithet sort of relates to terrifying and angry, and actually similarly to how we had with Enodia, Brimo was actually another Thessalonian goddess of the underworld before it became sort of an epithet or aspect of Hekate. It's also an epithet that's shared with gods like Persephone, Demeter, and Cybele. And we find it in conjunction with Hekate from about the 5th century BCE. So in this, it's sort of the same sort of time and region where Hekate starts to take on aspects of Enodia. She's also kind of getting the same from Brimo. In the Orphic Gold tablets, there's a reference to Brimo, and she forms this triad with Demeter and Persephone. And most people tend to think that Brimo is in reference to Hecate in that context. And when I say a triad with Demeter and Persephone, I'm not talking Maiden Mother Crone. I'm talking Persephone, Demeter, and Hecate, as a triplicate, but not as a feminine deific construct from Robert
An
Graves and all that.
amalgamation.
Yeah. Anyway, digressing. So you also find that role of Hecate within the Eleusinian mysteries, and within that, it said that Brimo gives birth to Brimios or Brumos, a sort of masculine version. And that happens at the climax of the Eleusinian festivities. Now, in her rather marvelous book, Circle for Hecate, Sarita de Este posits that some scholars interpret that this is Persephone giving birth, or they perceive it as Persephone giving birth to Iacchus, the torchbearer within the Eleusinian mysteries. But if Brimo of Eleusis is Hecate, then you start to get an echo of something similar that happens with the goddess Bendis in Thrace, where she gives birth to Zabasius, which is a sort of an earlier prototype of Dionysus. So you kind of, again, we're starting to get lots of lines crisscrossing, and it gets a bit confusing. But we start to see Hecate equated with Brimo. And then she starts to crop up in the Greek magical papyri, specifically when we look at Diphixiones, the curse tablets, where she is called on in these angry, terrifying, world-shattering sort of titanic notions to basically achieve whatever end it is that you're after. And there's a curious I don't know whether it's meant to be an altar or a sort of stand, but it's a triangular sort of altar found in at Pergamon, and it names a different Hekate in each of the three corners, and one of them is named as Brimo. And when Hekate is invoked by Medea, she's invoked in this Brimo aspect. She has snakes in her hair. The dogs are howling. There's a very much this building presence of foreboding.
Yeah.
Almost, imagine like a thunderstorm that hasn't quite broken, but just by looking at the sky and the feel of the pressure in the air that it's going to be a big one. That's kind of how I get the impression of Brimo when she's coming forth. And you can also see it with this, again, with the chthonic aspect. She, because she's said to burst forth from the underworld. So the snakes come slithering, the dogs start howling, and then she, almost like the worst nightmare coming out of a birthday cake type thing, just popping up and scaring everybody to death.
I'm gonna have that image forever now. Thank you.
But she, when Brimo was a I can't even pronounce Thessalian. That's it, Thessalian goddess. She was she drew the amorous attentions of Hermes, but she wasn't having it, and apparently her scream was so shrill and fierce that Hermes fled in terror. And it's said that that's where her name Brimo, as in terrifying, is said to originate from. However, there are some others that suggest that it comes from bromos, which is relation to the sound of flames crackling, which again is a really nice, well, not nice is the wrong word, but it's quite an evocative thing, because you think about hearing that deep snap and crackle of wood fire. You could imagine that being something a bit more scary. And again, you start to see Brimo used as a voces magicae, a barbarous word. So for instance, there is a string of voces magicae that says Brimo forba Brimo azibia, and we don't know what that means, but that's the point of these barbarous words. Nobody actually really knows what they mean anymore.
Yeah,
but
the Ephesian letters.
They knew what they meant. But Brimo obviously appears in that context, and yeah, I think Brimo at the moment is out there. She is definitely screaming and really shaking things, because I for a while now I felt that energy of her being abroad as Brimo, and I think it's not a moment too soon in a lot of instances.
There is several aspects of the goddess who are named as destroyer, dangerous, fearful. Here's a good one for you guys. Here we go. Chrysosandalem alpoticotonia.
What he said.
Try that shit out. This is the goddess of the lower world, wearing golden sandals and drinking blood. Now, when you think of that image, tell me this goddess standing in Hades in hell, wearing golden sandals, just chugging blood. Tell me that is not an image. So yeah, they had views of her as the Holy One, Orania, but then we've got this aspect too. So she covered all kinds of ground, you guys. Pretty much everything.
Yeah.
Um, and true story, I've been practicing saying that name because I knew Ken was coming on. But that image is
Even
one
I
I just,
can't pronounce it. So-
it took me like a while to get there. So there are terrifying instances of the goddess, but there are calm, gentle, loving cases of her also. She's the lover of solitude. She is the goddess of childbirth and child rearing. Um, so anybody who only wants to apply dead things to her is really limiting her and themselves.
yeah. And I mean, again, our well, not all of us, but a lot of our modern perceptions of deities can be exceptionally two-dimensional
Yeah.
and exceptionally sort of almost pinned down to this plane, if that makes sense. And as I've learned more about Hekate and have expanded my path and my working with her and stuff, I've come to view her very much getting bigger and more cosmic and more multi-dimensional and multifaceted. She's not just oh yeah, Hecate, she is the goddess of X, Y, and Z,
Yeah.
or she only does this.
She's everything.
Yeah.
She
And that
literally
is one
touches
of the
on
reasons
everything.
I think that why she's persisted, because she has literally been anything and everything to everyone and no one since time immemorial.
Let's talk about that persistence for just the last thing we're going to touch on, you guys. Let's talk about Triformis.
Mm,
When we think of Hecate, especially here in the West, we think triple goddess. You had mentioned it in triplicate a moment ago, which is why I wanted to touch on this. Hecate was not originally a three-bodied goddess.
no.
She was a single goddess. We applied those meanings to her.
Yeah, I mean, she was single formed, single bodied maiden goddess when she first appears in the sort of earliest literary references, which is Hesiod's in the Theogony. And I think it's about the 4th century BCE, possibly 3rd, where there's reference to Alcmenes making a triple-bodied statue that stood on the Acropolis or near the Parthenon, somewhere in Athensy type area. But those images were always 3 maiden goddesses of the same, youthful appearance. It was never this maiden mother crone thing that got sort of coined as in the modern context. And I think in that modern context, the confusion between Hecate being the crone in that triplicate, but also being a triple goddess as well, it became very convoluted and confusing. But obviously, even when she did start to have triple forms in antiquity, they were always of this sort of more youthful, perfect, maiden concept. And even when we start to get ideas of her in these terrifying aspects, with snakes in her hair and blood drinking and all that kind of stuff. Nowhere does it actually specify, oh, well, then in this context, she's ugly or she's old or, it's never mentioned. She's just scary. That, and I think it's a very modern Western thing and also a very patriarchal thing that a woman who is powerful therefore has to be twisted and ugly and, deformed because of it. Again, we go into the whole thing of the concept of the witch through time, the way it's the way that the archetypal witch has been perceived as women shouldn't have this power or shouldn't be able to be independent because look what happens.
Right.
And it's, excuse my word, it's BS. That's a load of old bunkum.
You're on Bobby's channel. Say it. It's bullshit.
Well, there you go. You said it for me. But yeah, no, it's. I think we're coming out the other side of this notion of people associating Hekate with this crone aspect. There are still people that find it, that they connect with it, and that's fine, so long as they're not professing that, again, that's what she is and that's all she is. If you've done the work, you'll know that she isn't. But if that's how she comes through to you, then that's between you and the goddess. But you can't kind of throw all of the historical record out and say, well, none of that actually matters because Aleister Crowley once said that she was a barren crone,
right?
So, that kind of thing. So,
to be fair, this is something that I've told you in the past. When I was educated when I was introduced to Hekate, the people I learned from only viewed her in one aspect, and that's what I was taught. I was taught the mad goddess aspect of it in the magic worker. I didn't learn about the truth of the matter for decades. And I'm still learning and expanding my knowledge. And 90% of that is up to you. You sparked that change with the deck you put out. I was like, well, son of a bitch, I've been wrong all this time, so I had to go back and unlearn everything, break out new books, break out old books, and learn from my bollocks. Yes.
yes, a very British word, bollocks.
Yeah. So yeah, that and I've been talking about that a lot recently, of having to unlearn old patterns and learn proper ones, but that is what I needed at the time, so that is what was given to me. I'm not saying it was wrong, it was just minimalist. I had this part when it's actually this,
Yeah.
so
But, everybody starts somewhere.
yeah,
And
exactly.
and this isn't, it's not just in relation to Hecate, but if you're learning something and you're learning it with an open mind to change your viewpoint when new information comes along, that's how that's how we all should be doing things. We should challenge ourselves and challenge our beliefs and our thoughts and concepts, because they're not always going to stay static in the same. But there
Yeah.
are too many people that are like, no, this is the way it's got to be because this is the way it's always been. And it's like, yeah, but it's not relevant anymore. You've got to kind of, if you want something to be living and breathing as a tradition, you've got to move with the times. It's no good, it's no good being all holy and ancient when you don't even live in that world anymore. There's got to be a sort of middle ground between the ancient inspirations and the modern applications to
That's why I
sort of,
tell people, look at the time they were in, that these aspects were necessary for the time. Like when we think Hermes as the god of travelers, the god of cattle. Well, cattle was money
Yes.
Cattle was everything at that time. That was what drove society at that moment, what everybody depended on. So cattlemen and shepherds had to be warriors, guards, accountants, deal makers. That is why Hermes and the roads and traveling, Hermes was worshipped everywhere but temples. Um, I think there was maybe 2 temples to Hermes, and I'm going to have a whole episode of my version, my episode of epithets for Hermes. So tune in for that. I don't mean to get sidetracked. The Fates and Hekate.
Mm.
I knew the Fates before I knew Hekate, basically. So when I saw cards in your deck like Patropeos, the averter of evil, which is linked to um, the third aspect of the Morai,
Hmm.
um, I'm gonna let you answer about the Fates and Hecate, and then I swear I'm gonna cut us off. I promise.
So there are links, and again, you find them in the PGM specifically, where lots of names are used sort of in conjunction with, Hecate, or she's named with the Fates and the Furies, and lots of other triplicities. Not necessarily to say that they're one and the same, but to say that they are aspected of each other. When you look at the Furies, you see, imagery that you would recognize on, say, Brimo, the snakes in the
The
hair,
snakes in the hair.
the shrill, constant, like scream, voicey type thing. Then with the Fates, you've got this notion of a triplicity that kind of can be seen as a maiden mother crone in a rough kind of way. And then you've got this notion of the liminality of, metering out from birth to death. You've got that severing note motion that Atropos does, that you could see with the symbology of things like Hecate's knife. So that you kind of, again, you can kind of start to draw parallels, and you can kind of see them referenced in antiquity, but they are definitely like separate.
Awesome. All right, everybody. I'm going to open the floor up to see if anybody has questions for Ken about the goddess Hecate. Um,
I
if
think I saw
not,
one about, somebody was asking about Medusa. That's gone up the thing
oh,
again now.
let me see. Oh, I think was this the comment you're making?
No,
Snakes in the hair.
I think it was after that one.
Yes, that's funny.
I think somebody asks whether
Uh,
Hecate had any connection to Medusa.
oh, I see it. I see it. I see it.
Oh, well,
I
yeah, there we
want.
go.
So let's talk about Gorgo for a second.
Yeah, so in the deck, there is a card for Gorgo, the Grim, which is related to Gorgons, and obviously the main Gorgon everybody remembers is Medusa. Nobody ever tends to remember her sisters.
Sisters.
The fact that she's got 2 immortal sisters and she happened to be the one that was mortal. Um, Everybody remembers her for that. There are, again, you've got these parallels between Medusa and Gorgons and Hecate in her more serpentine aspects. Gorgons as a sort of spiritual motif were used in antiquity as apotropaic.
When
Uh,
we say a patropaic, to keep bad things away.
yeah, to keep things. So you'd see a Gorgon's head on a shield or over a doorway. You know, Athena's Aegis is the head of Medusa onto her armor. So there's that very protective, defensive aspect to it. And again, you can see the connections in that context between Gorgons and Medusa and Hekate, because so it's almost like a guarding of the liminal crossway between entrances and thresholds and city gates and all that kind of thing. And then again, you've got, you know, the sort of all of the serpentine epithets, and she, you know, Hecate's got lots, you know, snakes in her hair, snakes around her waist, snakes for legs, you know, snake heads, snake scales, you know, sometimes she's drawn by snakes, you know, the snakes everywhere. So if you don't like snakes, tough. So yeah, there is a very much this the notion of the, you know, the tragic figure of Medusa, you know, oh boo-hoo kind of thing. I don't see her like that at all. I recently kind of had a bit of a moment with Medusa's tale, that, you know, everybody goes, oh, you know, she was punished because she was raped, and she was, you know, she was an affront to the goddess Athena, and da da da. And even though I know that traditional Gorgons were, you know, they had beards and lolling tongues and tusks, you know, they're not these voluptuous serpentine women with snakes for hair kind of thing. I just got this notion that what if the curse to turn, you know, most people say men to stone, other people say anything to stone. But, you know, to turn men to stone wasn't as a punishment, but it was actually the goddess's way of protecting her to the extent that no one could take advantage of her ever again, to make her so beautiful that to look on her would literally, you know, I think in a way, especially for the times, you know, to make a woman so confident and empowered by her body and her beauty that men just couldn't hack it, and literally would just petrify. And obviously that's the root of that word, you know, petrify, to turn to stone. But we, you know, and we see it with today with the slogans, you know, petrify the patriarchy. It's, you know, because the patriarchy gets scared when women start getting power and start getting, you know,
Oh
vociferous,
gosh.
breaking the snakes and, you know, all the rest of it, getting your tatters out and all that kind of stuff.
Right. That is. There were several aspects of Hecate which I wanted to put on the list. You guys don't know. I edited down to like 20 names outside of the ones Ken was talking about. Even editing it down to that was a chore, and it took me 3 days to figure out which ones I wanted to put on the screen for you guys. I can't imagine the stress you were going through putting the deck together with trying to only get certain amounts of names.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, you know, there was a couple of last minute changes, but I was kind of pretty sure which ones I kind of wanted to touch on. But obviously I was consulting, you know, lots of lists, and I you know, and I will mention for anybody that wants to know more, as in like all the different epithets, there are some really good resources out there. So Matt Oren, the author Matt Oren, he has a blog. If you type into Google epithets of Hecate, his blog is usually one of the first ones to come up, and he has listed A to Z of the vast majority.
That's one of the reasons. That's one of the places I got these names from. Yeah.
And there is also Sarah Naheti Croft has a Tumblr called Singing for Her, and she did a project where she listed all of the epithets. And what she's actually done is she's gone a little bit further in putting them into sort of, she's categorized them basically from different sources. So you get all of your very old sources, then you get your ones that are kind of a bit more modern, and then you get your ones that don't have any ancient connection but get mentioned in later things. and then she did a few in-depth explorations of them. So that her Tumblr's called Singing for Her, Epithets of Hekate. And of course, the Covenant of Hekate, they do a lot of projects, and a lot of them, sometimes they'll explore different epithets. A lot of the sanctuaries that people facilitate are named after a specific epithet, and that's usually because that they that's the remit of that sanctuary falls under the guise of that particular epithet. Yes, so that's Matt Orrick's blog and Sarah Nehety Croft's Tumblr are two really good resources.
And then you reference Soteira a lot. Soteira
Yeah.
de Estes.
So I mean, Soteira this is one of her books, Circle for Hekate. This one is literally about the history and the mythology. So she talks about how Hekate has evolved through antiquity. She talks about the different conflations with other goddesses. She talks about the cult within different areas. And then she also talks about a lot of the sort of the common and not so common symbols that we see associated with Hekate through statues and iconography in antiquity. That is a really, really good book.
Hold on 1 second. Hold on. What? Actually, Ken, let's just go ahead and end it there because I will keep going and I don't want to keep you. Thank you so much for joining us.
I will say to Essence of the Moon, yes, it's in the works.
I've been talking to her about it. I'm like, please let them put it out, please. All right, everybody. Thank you for joining us today to discuss the names of the goddess we hold so dear. And Ken, would you be willing to come back in the future and tackle a few more names?
Yeah, I'm sure we can find another in the hundreds that we haven't covered.
Right? All right. I appreciate you, man. Stick around. We'll talk backstage. And everybody else, love you. Love you all. Miss Tarot D has a show tonight you might want to check out. So I'll see you guys. And be sure you tune in on Thursday for Behind the Moon. Bye-bye.